Greetings, everyone. An unprecedented bitter end to power in Tehran. Ladies and gentlemen, Iran's leadership apparatus is now reeling in an unimaginably dire situation. In their desperation, they are forced to hide deep underground, trembling and evading like creatures driven to the brink. That is the instinct of the weak when faced with danger. While the whole world is focusing its attention on the rain of missiles and the fierce destruction from the war between the US, Israel, and Iran, behind closed doors, a quieter but even more terrifying scenario is unfolding. The ruling elite of Iran, such as the mullahs, who have held absolute power for decades, have now begun to fall into a state of utter panic. Their fear is not limited to the visible, tangible damage that can be seen with the naked eye. They understand clearly that an even more terrifying prospect is looming ahead. Even if the gunfire stops today, their lives will never be able to return to the way they were before. Why is that? The answer is very simple but harsh. They are running out of money. This is not an exaggeration at all. Iran's economy is collapsing, and these clerics are losing the only weapon that keeps their power machine running. That is cash. For many years, the flow of money. This regime has maintained control by using money to reward loyalists and sustain the government apparatus. That system can only survive as long as the cash flow keeps running strong. But now that cycle is breaking down. Once the money is gone, noble titles and tactics of spreading fear will also lose their inherent power. To understand why this is so important, we need to look back to the time before the war broke out. Iran entered 2021 not with a strong economy that was suddenly destroyed by conflict. The truth is that this country has been suffering from a severe financial shortage for many years. The war was simply the fatal blow that exposed the wounds that had already been festering. Even before the first missiles tore through the sky, Iran had already been struggling under the harshest sanctions, which dealt painful blows to the lifeblood of its economy. These sanctions have choked Iran's oil exports down to about 1.5 million barrels per day by 2025. That's less than half of what the country used to produce before 2018. That means government revenue has dropped dramatically. At the same time, key industries are also struggling to survive. Foreign investors are withdrawing in large numbers. At the same time, the rial, Iran's currency, has depreciated rapidly. By the end of 2025, the rial had lost nearly 95% of its value compared to just a few years earlier. These numbers are not just lifeless statistics on paper. It represents the collapse of daily life, the devastation of the economy, and the complete breakdown of trust among the people. Naturally, when trust in the currency is gone, the economy begins to fluctuate violently. When trust is lost, price surges begin, sweeping everywhere. Inflation soared to 50% by mid-2025 and showed no signs of stopping, reaching 68% this year. For many Iranians, this crisis had existed long before the first sounds of war erupted. It drives up costs, shrinks paychecks, and creates a quiet fear that the future will only be filled with darkness and hardship. This is what has made the war so brutal and destructive. It's not the direct cause. To be precise, it's the last straw that pushes an already fragile system beyond its limits. In the end, the pressure had been building up for many years. The sanctions have isolated Iran from most of the global financial system, leading to a shortage of investment and leaving no options to cope. The government could only cling to short-term stopgap solutions for deeply rooted problems that required skillful and careful governance. Corruption was like termites gnawing away, draining precious resources that could have been used to stabilize the country. State-owned enterprises kept consuming money like bottomless pits, without bringing any significant benefits. And throughout that process, the specter of inflation kept eroding every paycheck and every bit of savings people had. At the time the war between the US, Israel, and Iran broke out, this economy was not just weak, it was barely surviving on its last breaths, completely unable to withstand any further shocks.
Sốc nào nữa?
And war is a brutal shock that happens every day, every hour. As the war escalated, everything started to go downhill at a dizzying speed. The scale of the attacks, the relentless pace of the battles, and the suffocating pressure on infrastructure forced Iran to burn through money much faster than it could recover. This wasn't a short conflict that a country could easily get through. This was a constant and relentless pressure. Each act of retaliation had a cost, always paid in cash. Each attack destroyed priceless assets. Every promise to allies created a huge bill that this regime still has no way to pay. That's why the priorities changed overnight. The economy is now both a war chest and an open wound that keeps bleeding. Billions of dollars have been poured into missiles, drones, and support operations for proxy groups in the region. At the same time, sanctions have become tighter than ever, making it much harder to earn money or move capital across borders. Iran has truly fallen into a dilemma, a very dire situation. Military spending skyrocketed while revenues were squeezed to the point of suffocation. You can clearly see Iran's exhaustion when you look at their foreign currency reserves. Just a decade ago, this country held over $120 billion in reserves. However, in recent months, that number has plummeted dramatically to only about $20 to $30 billion. This is a complete collapse of financial power. With no reserves left, the government has almost lost the ability to protect the value of the currency, reassure the market, or ease the devastating effects of inflation. Even the only possible lifeline, which is the high oil prices, is also limited by harsh barriers. High global oil prices only matter if you can actually export your oil, and most importantly, you have to be able to get paid. But under pressure and obstruction from the US, Iran's export routes have been seriously disrupted. Trade has become more difficult than ever, and sanctions continue to block the normal flow of money. Therefore, even when prices are favorable, the regime cannot fully benefit and the mullahs cannot fill their pockets. Revenue that once sustained the system is now unstable, scarce, and under heavy pressure. Confronting Israel and the United States is not only a military challenge, but also a daily war of economic attrition. Money keeps flowing out, but very little comes back in. The government is struggling to sustain a conflict that demands more resources every week. And things are even worse because the very foundation they're standing on was already cracked before the war began. That's why the damage is so obvious. The supermarket shelves are empty and there's a shortage. Imported goods are delayed. Workers have to wait endlessly for their wages, which arrive late or sometimes never come at all. Prices are rising so quickly that families can't keep up. Debts keep piling up as the government tries to hold everything together with limited tools and a depleted budget. As for the wealthy, they are truly panicking as they witness this scene unfold, and their riches are vanishing like smoke. Let's take a look at one of the clearest warning signs that Iran's economy is plunging into the abyss. That is the banking system. Iran's banking system is sinking deeper and facing a severe crisis. Banks are supposed to keep money flowing, provide loans, support businesses, and create the sense that the economy is still running smoothly. Those are the most basic principles, right? That's why when banks start to collapse, it's a sign of a real crisis. This turning point became clear at the end of 2025 when Bank Yonder, one of Iran's largest private banks, was forced to close. Deposits and debts worth about 2.5 quadrillion rials, equivalent to around $5 billion, did not simply disappear. They were transferred to Bank Mali, the largest state-owned bank. On the surface, this looked like a rescue, but in reality, it was a warning shot signaling disaster. The problem wasn't solved at all. It was simply moved elsewhere. Pressure once focused on a corrupt organization now weighed heavily on another key part of the system. The cause of Bank Yander's collapse exposed the utter rot at the very core of the financial sector. This bank was already notorious for insider lending and corruption. They poured money into politically connected projects that would never be able to pay it back. It threw billions of dollars into extravagant projects like Iran Man in Tehran, the largest shopping mall in the world. It became a monument to reckless waste instead of a sustainable source of revenue. At the same time, Yander Bank attracted deposits by offering extremely high interest rates, far exceeding official limits. This unintentionally created a deadly financial spiral. It was a trap. The money from new depositors was used to pay off the obligations of earlier ones. By the end of 2025, this bank's debts had ballooned to a staggering figure, 2.5 quadrillion reals. This made it one of the biggest and most tragic financial collapses in Iran's history. When this bank collapsed, the government had no choice but to step in and bear all the losses. But the price to pay for that solution was the hollowing out of Bank Mehdi. Instead of stabilizing the system, the regime dumped all the risks onto its largest state-owned bank, making the entire financial structure of the country more fragile and vulnerable than ever before. To make up for Iran's massive losses, they were forced to print more money, and this very action pushed inflation, which was already above 45%, into a new, devastating spiral. The currency kept collapsing uncontrollably. Unemployment rates soared, and poverty dug deeper into every corner of society. The Iran crisis was a warning that Iran's financial foundation was crumbling. And Iran wasn't even the only weak point in this system. Many other banks were also struggling under heavy pressure, including Sepia, Milat, Zai, and Zamzamin. Among them, Sepia played a particularly important role because of its close and inseparable ties to the Revolutionary Guard. It wasn't just a commercial bank, it was the lifeblood connected to military projects and the state's strategic activities. If such a bank were to collapse, the damage wouldn't stop at the financial sector. It would spread like a virus throughout the core security structure of the regime. So why were these banks in such a disastrously weak state? The answer is very simple. For many years, they have been burdened by massive bad debts. Money was poured into state-owned companies that were losing money, politically connected projects, and insiders' business ventures that rarely generated real profits. On paper, those loans are still listed as valuable assets. But the harsh reality is that many of them will never be repaid. Huge losses are hidden by clever accounting tricks and covert government support, creating the illusion of a healthy economy. But when you peel back that shiny facade, the ugly and terrifying truth is that banks have been struggling for a long time, barely hanging on, while the elite and clergy are draining them like parasites sucking their host dry. This weakness has a direct and ruthless impact on the broader economy. As banks lose their strength, they stop supporting growth. Lending dries up completely. Businesses that need credit to import goods, pay workers, or simply survive day-to-day begin to fall into desperate stagnation. Production grinds to a halt, supply tightens, and prices skyrocket. Jobs gradually disappear. What started in the banking sector spreads everywhere, destroying the value of everyday life. For ordinary people, the impact is immediate and extremely painful. A lifetime of savings suddenly loses value rapidly. In some cases, accessing those funds becomes more uncertain than ever. Delays in withdrawals start to happen more often. Trust, the most precious asset, slowly vanishes into thin air. Once people no longer believe their money is safe in the bank, they will do anything to move it elsewhere. Some desperately hunt for dollars, others hoard gold, and some are forced to turn to risky black markets. In addition, groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and militia forces in Iraq and Syria are not just simple allies. They are extensions of the regime's influence and power. They give Iran a position and power that extends beyond its own borders. If you look at the actual numbers, you can see how serious this commitment is. The Hezbollah organization alone has received aid of nearly $700 million a year. Hamas also gets around $100 million. In Syria, billions of dollars have been spent to keep Bashar al-Assad in power through military aid, oil shipments, and long-term lines of credit. Although that effort has failed, money continues to be spent without stopping. The Houthi group also receives hundreds of millions of dollars to maintain their missile and drone programs, while militia forces in Iraq continue to receive abundant funding and military equipment. In total, Iran has spent more than $16 billion on this network since 2012. From the perspective of the current leadership, this is like an insurance policy for survival. It keeps Iran in an important position in the region and helps protect the regime from direct external threats. Without these groups, Iran's influence would be significantly reduced, and they would become more isolated than ever on the geopolitical chessboard. Those financial resources could have been used to stabilize the currency, save banks on the verge of collapse, or improve essential public services. However, that flow of money is leaving the country at a time when the entire system is under immense pressure. As the current conflict becomes increasingly fierce, the outflow of money shows no sign of slowing down. In fact, it's exploding even more. More drones, more missiles, more logistical operations, and countless support packages to keep those armed groups operating. Meanwhile, inside Iran's borders, civilian projects are starting to stall and fall into neglect. The roads are in poor condition and lack maintenance. The national power grid is unstable from overloading. The clean water system can't meet minimum demand anymore. Hospitals are facing severe shortages of medicine and medical equipment. And bitterly, teachers have to reluctantly accept delayed salaries or even go without pay for many months. A tragic contrast is clearly visible. National resources are poured into distant conflicts while the everyday lives of the people suffer. It keeps getting worse and more exhausting every day as time goes by. This pain has transformed into something much deeper and more dangerous. Many Iranian people have seen through the bitter truth that their living conditions are falling into an abyss, while huge amounts of money are being spent lavishly in distant places beyond the borders. That gap creates extreme outrage and fuels unrest. This anger has been simmering for many years. The killing of Mahsa Amini while in custody in 2022 sparked an uprising called Women, Life, Freedom. Women bravely burned their hijabs right on the street to reclaim their right to live. The bloody crackdowns took the lives of hundreds of people, but they never extinguished that resilient flame of resistance. That flame kept smoldering throughout 2025, then flared up fiercely when the currency collapsed and hyperinflation hit at the end of last year. Instead of easing wasteful spending or fighting corruption, they shifted the cash flows to protect the networks of cronies that help maintain the regime's power. In 2022, healthcare spending was pushed to the bottom, accounting for less than 5% of the national budget. Meanwhile, allocations for the military and security remained unchanged. Subsidies tied to loyalists were absolutely protected, while hospitals, schools, and infrastructure were pushed to the end of the priority list. The business empires of the ISGC and corporations owned by the ruling elite were strictly protected, while public services continued to deteriorate. Corruption drained billions of dollars every year, with reports estimating that up to 30% of public contracts fell into the hands of bribe takers. Western governments began freezing accounts, sanctioning loyalists, and targeting real estate linked to the Khomeini family. The fear that had kept people silent for years began to weaken. For decades, that fear did not exist naturally, it was enforced. The regime relied on the ISGC to suppress all resistance, sending armed units into the streets to fire on protesters, imprisoning thousands, and threatening entire communities. That system remained stable because the ISGC was always loyal, well-paid, and spread terror. That balance only worked as long as the money kept flowing. If the ISGC was weakened by external pressure and the Artesh military began to play a more central role, the clerics would lose their most reliable tool of control. Once that happened, the system would begin to unravel. Without money, they could not maintain loyalty. Workers who had seen their wages collapse and students who had faced gun barrels instead of dialogue would never forget what they had experienced. That frustration was suppressed, not resolved. When the regime could no longer pay subsidies or fund the forces, militias, or stabilize the currency, that pressure would have nowhere else to go. It would erupt. History has proven that moments like these can change incredibly quickly. In Romania in 1989, Ceausescu's regime seemed solid until the army refused to keep firing on civilians, and it collapsed overnight. In Libya in 2021, Gaddafi's control dissolved as soon as his financial and military networks were taken down. In both cases, change did not come slowly. It happened when the control enforcement system failed. Iran may face a similar turning point. Once the ISGC weakens, the Artesh military advances, and the clergy run out of money, the structure that holds everything together will start to collapse. In your opinion, how much longer do you think the ISGC will survive?